Let's talk about being prepared. Aren't you ready for life to get back to normal? I know I am, but there's one thing none of us can afford to ignore. Another crisis can happen at any time without warning. But this time you can have peace of mind knowing you're prepared in advance for whatever happens. So ask yourself, do you have enough food, water, emergency supplies to get through the next time? If not, you need to check out My Patriot Supply. They are America's leading preparedness company, and they'll help you become happily self-reliant. Their mission is your survival. Their food is delicious too and stays fresh up to 25 years, so it'll be there when you need it. You won't have to worry if something bad happens. You'll be well prepared. Order today and your food will be delivered in 2 to 3 days. Go to preparewithx22.com right now and do what you know you need to do. That's preparewithx22.com or click the link in the description. Hi, and welcome to the X22 Report Spotlight. Today we have a returning guest, Harley Schlanger. Harley is an historian, a national spokesman. He's been covering the financial industry since the 80s. You can now follow Harley at the LaRouche organization. I'll be putting all the links at the bottom of the video. And I am very happy to have Harley back on the X22 Report Spotlight. Harley, welcome back to the Spotlight.
Well, Dave, I always enjoy our discussions. I'm glad to be here with you.
You know, Harley, so do I. I think we get into a lot of great topics here. And we really flush it out. And I wanted to start off with the economy. Now, Trump was in office for 4 years. We saw him reverse regulations, cut taxes, renegotiated trade deals, placed tariffs on China. We saw some of the industries starting to come back. And then Biden, he came into the White House. And, you know, right off the bat, we saw him kill the pipeline deal. We saw him basically do a lot of other things where he reversed the executive orders. And all of a sudden, we're starting to see inflation. I mean, corn prices are going up, wheat's going up, lumber's going up, oil's going up. A lot of people see that now. And, you know, the economy is not going as well as everyone thought it was going to go. Actually, now he's even reversing course on basically saying, listen, you don't have to pay back your student loan. So everything that he said he was going to do, it seems that the opposite is happening. And I think the people are seeing this. When you look at the economy and you see all of his policies, and I don't really think it's his policies, I think it's people above him. Where do you see this economy going? What's the end game of these individuals?
Well, I think we're heading to a systemic breakdown of the financial system worldwide. And the dollar is one of the centerpieces of that breakdown because of this policy of the Federal Reserve of quantitative easing, zero interest rates. But importantly, they're not making the interest rates, the cheap credit available to the sectors of the economy that need it, those involved in physical production, in goods transportation, and things of that sort. Instead, it's going to the worst speculators, the ones who were responsible for the 2008 crash, the ones who were running up are running up the corporate debt. We see a situation where nearly 45% of new corporate bonds are being rated at or near junk level. And we have this new phenomena. It's not really a new phenomena. Michael Milken was exploiting this back in the 80s, but the idea of zombie corporations, companies that don't make enough profit to pay the interest on their debt, suddenly getting new credit to go out and buy stock. Now, I agree that what a number of things that President Trump did were beneficial, and he was going in the right direction with the trade policy, the rejection of the TPP, questioning the free trade approach of both the Democrats and the Republicans. The one quarrel I had with him was, I think it was not his fault, but it was forced on him, having to look at the appreciation of the stock market as proof of a strong economy. He correctly identified that when Obama said that that was proof of a strong economy, that it was a fraud. But I think he was somewhat trapped by the position of the Federal Reserve on this. And now we see Biden embracing the Federal Reserve, embracing Yellen's anti-production policies, the bubble policy. So I think what we're looking at is a bubble of probably $2 quadrillion or more in speculative paper that's about to collapse. And there's no way you can keep bailing it out without launching hyperinflation. You mentioned building materials. Last month, there was a 14% drop in new home construction. And that's when we're in the middle of a hot period for housing purchases. Why is it dropping? Because of the cost of building materials.
Mm.
People can't get loans now because no one can be sure how much it's going to cost to build a house. So I think we're headed toward an incredibly perilous path. We're going to see more shutdowns. People are going to have more trouble meeting basic needs, whether it's rent or mortgages, food, medical care, transportation. And, the strategy of the Biden team of going for a green economy and pumping up, putting money into a green financial bubble is not going to work. It's just going to blow up in their faces. The problem is it could blow up in all of our faces. And that's why this is such an existential crisis.
Now, all of this that you're talking about, it seems that this was set up for the reset, where we had this pandemic. We were supposed to have the entire world shut down for many years. Governments were going to push stimulus. People were going to stay home. As they pushed stimulus, people would receive a check at universal basic income or whatever you want to call it. And this way, the central bankers, they could say, you know something, look what the pandemic did. We need to make a change. We need a reset. And this is why the system's failing, because of what happened here. And we had to close everything down, and the governments had to borrow and borrow and borrow. And this would cover up everything that they wanted to do. But now the economies of the world, they're opening back up. They didn't get what they wanted. They didn't get the shutdown for 3, 4, 5 years. So is the Great Reset, is this backfiring on them?
Well, you have to realize, and I know you know this, and
Mm.
probably a lot of your listeners do, the Great Reset is a fantasy to start with, but they have the power, or they thought they had the power, to impose it. What they're looking at is a situation in which they're trying to destroy every sovereign nation state on the planet. When you talk about globalists, and we hear the word globalist a lot, let's just examine for a second what that means. That means corporate cartels, especially in finance and insurance, the shadow banking system, raw materials, and so on, that exist over and above the authority and power of nation states. And with institutions such as the European Union, the World Bank and International Monetary Fund, and the global central banks, they exist to allow a speculative economy to flourish outside of the control of the nation. That is, the Federal Reserve makes its credit policy based on what bankrupt, too big to fail banks need, not what is necessary for the nation to function. And we've gone down this road now for 30 to 40 years since 1971. It's almost 50 years since Nixon removed the dollar from the gold reserve and set up the floating exchange rate system. And that's been taken advantage of by these central bankers and the largest banks with the free trade agreements, with the repeal of things such as Glass-Steagall banking regulations. So they turned everything into a global casino. Now that's collapsing. They can't keep it going. So the Great Reset is a kind of a silly name, but what it means is that they're insisting that the central banks, which are private banks, not government banks, but private banks, will not only control monetary policy and credit, but will take over spending policy as well. That's what was laid out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming 2 years ago by people like Mark Carney from the Bank of England, Fink from BlackRock, Moynihan from Bank of America, Jamie Dimon. They're all committed to this because what they're saying is that under conditions of crisis, elected representatives sometimes respond to the needs of the constituents, but that would mean they'd have to go after the speculators. So therefore, they're trying to take all power away from elected bodies, whether it's a president, as we saw with the coup in the United States, or with the complete mess in the Congress, where the Congress doesn't look like they could organize a two-car funeral. But if you eliminate the threat of constituencies mobilizing for necessary programs like transportation, like infrastructure, like manufacturing. If you take that power away from them, then you control them. And whether you give them a few bucks as a stimulus policy or just let them battle each other in the gig economy, that's what we're headed towards. All power going to the hands of the central bankers who will appoint technocrats to decide where the spending should be. Now, we know where they're going to say it's got to go into the bubble. Uh, Someone from BlackRock, who's on one of the committees that's working on this, said that they intend to have 30 to 50 trillion dollars in a pool between central banks and private equity for the green financial bubble. And we see things like Janet Yellen creating a compliance board in the Federal Reserve, which will make sure that no credit goes to any company that produces a so-called carbon footprint. In other words, if you're in construction, if you're in steel or manufacturing, machine tool production, plastics, fossil fuels, you're not going to get credit. They're going to shut them down and impose this insane green economy with so-called sustainable infrastructure, which doesn't sustain anything except the speculative bubble. So I think that the Great Reset, as you said, is a reaction to the failure of their policies and an attempt to prevent any nation from asserting sovereignty over its economic policies. Now, that's the other problem they have. There are some nations that won't go along with that. Hopefully, the United States would be one of the nations that rejects that. And we're seeing, Dave, on the state level, people objecting to the executive orders from Biden on green energy and things of that sort. We see the Russians and the Chinese thumbing their nose at the Green New Deal. The Indian energy minister, when John Kerry went there, Kerry did his pitch.
Mm-hmm.
We're all going to go to net zero carbon. And the Indian energy minister said, oh, well, that may be very well and good for your country. But we have a policy of development for India. And we work with other countries that still want to develop and still want electricity and still want modern technology. So I don't think we'll go along with that. So I think it's not going to work. The question is, can we mobilize an alternative policy and either scare the hell out of the existing congressman or elect a new Congress to get back to the American system of physical economics.
When I hear you talking about all of this, and I started to think about what has been happening, I think they could have gotten away with this whole, green energy and moving us into this, new system if there was a major crisis, like for example, like a war, because you would have loss of life, you would have destruction, and not many governments or people would object to it. The same thing with the pandemic. If we were going along this track and it lasted, and I remember the New York Times article saying that it's going to take 10 years for a vaccine, so we're going to be in this pandemic for many years. I think we would have seen a lot of loss of life, not from the pandemic, but from keeping people in their homes depressed, and I think from everything being shut down, the world economy would not be able to function. And I think they would be able to make their case of saying, listen, this is a crisis that we've never seen before. We have to do this or we're doomed. Now, since countries are opening their economies back up and people are going back to work, going back to school, what they're saying to the leaders of all different countries, I don't think it carries the same weight. You know what I mean?
Well, you made a very important point, which is the connection between the financial crisis and the war danger. And this is the real reason why there was so much antagonism from the intelligence community, from the so-called deep state, by the media cartels against Donald Trump. Because one of the bedrock principles of Trump's campaign was we're going to end these endless wars, because the American people get no benefit from them. In fact, they're a disaster in terms of loss of money, loss of life, destruction of other nations, creating enemies around the world. And the idea that he would talk with Russia and China, even if there were disagreements, And he had his disagreements with China, but he and Xi Jinping sat down and hammered out a trade agreement. And I think if he had a second term, we would have had a phase two on the trade agreement and things would have moved along in a much better way. So the idea that Trump was going to turn against these endless wars was completely anathema to them. They had to get rid of him. They had to pull off a coup. And it's also why they're engaged in regime change against Russia with the Navalny operation and trying to get the US Congress to put sanctions on virtually everything in Russia, everything in China, because the effort to destroy a sovereign nation is at the core of what they're trying to do. I often refer to a book that was written, I think, in 1992 by Walt Wriston of Citibank, who was one of the key people in pushing the financial changes that created the too big to fail banks. His book was called The Twilight of Sovereignty. And his argument is that we cannot have sovereign nations in a modern world. And the idea that President Trump was putting forward the idea of sovereignty for America, but in coordination with other sovereign nations, destroys the whole globalist fabric. So, what better way to destroy the opposition coming from Trump than to run a coup against him, blaming it on Russia, turning the American people against the Russians and the Chinese and against their own government at a time when the government is actually being run by these bankers who are planning to, I mean, what's their ultimate goal, Dave? It's not just a global central bank dictatorship. It is to reduce population.
Mm.
They've said it over and over and over. And if you have governments run by people like Donald Trump or Putin who are committed to new technologies and improving the living standards of their people, that goes against the whole intent of the Great Reset and why the Great Reset needs the Green New Deal as its companion. So I think it's a fascinating moment, and I think too many people are pessimistic because they see all the crap that's coming out of the Biden administration, and they're saying, "How can we beat it? We tried. They stole the election. They are wrecking everything. How can we beat it?" Well, these guys, as they say, they ain't that bright. Their programs are based on dumbing down the population and demoralizing the population. And that's why I think you're right about this idea. Had the pandemic gone on for 5 years, people would be already. We saw the suicide rate was up, the household violence rate was up. So if you turn people inward and against each other, it's easier to control them. And then if you have a big war, whether it's an actual war or just a threat of war, it's another way of control. Orwell, of course, writes about this in 1984. So I think people have to look at the potential that we have in spite of what's been done in the period from November 3rd to the present. One of the benefits we have is that more people are figuring out that our nation does have some enemies that are internal and that we have to clean up.
I just want to go back to 1 sec because they were planning on this reset, and governments, they were borrowing like crazy. Central banks were printing like crazy. They took this currency, and this is different than 2009, 2010. Let's talk about being prepared. Aren't you ready for life to get back to normal? I know I am, but there's one thing none of us can afford to ignore. Another crisis can happen at any time without warning. But this time you can have peace of mind knowing you're prepared in advance for whatever happens. So ask yourself, do you have enough food, water, emergency supplies to get through the next time? If not, you need to check out My Patriot Supply. They're America's leading preparedness company, and they'll help you become happily self-reliant. Their mission is your survival. Their food is delicious too and stays fresh up to 25 years, so it'll be there when you need it. You won't have to worry if something bad happens. You'll be well prepared. Order today and your food will be delivered in 2 to 3 days. Go to preparewithx22.com right now and do what you know you need to do. That's preparewithx22.com or click the link in the description. Because that currency really went to the stock market, into banks. This currency that they created trillions and trillions of dollars, this went into people's hands now. And the people now are putting it back into the system. So I mean, since they didn't get what they wanted and economies are opening up, people are taking these funds now and spending it or maybe saving it, whatever they're doing with it. I mean, is this a place where all of a sudden we will see inflation because of
Well,
all
we're
of this?
already seeing inflation, but I don't fully agree with what you said about
Okay.
giving it to people because, if you think about $1,400 as a once in a 6 or 8 month handout, that's not really a lot compared to the trillions that are still going to banks. We're seeing more mergers, we're seeing more LBOs, we're seeing money being spread around in the financial system. Uh, and the I read a report the other day where the usual rate of growth of money supply is about 1 to 2% a year. From March 2020 to March 2021, it was 78% increase in the flow of money. Now, that's a lot bigger than 1,400 per person. So I think what we have to see is that they are trying to buy people off with a little bit here and a little bit there, but mostly they're worried about the potential for a domino style collapse, either a blowout in the derivatives, financial derivatives markets, or big corporate bankruptcy. Some of these corporations have grown in huge ways. I mean, think about this. What's the real money? What's the real wealth behind Facebook and Amazon? They talk about Bezos being worth almost $200 billion. His worth is tied up in Amazon stock. In the old days, wealth was people who owned property, who owned machinery, who owned the ability to produce something. If you start having a collapse, and we saw what happened with the digital currencies in the last few weeks, these large volumes of money can be wiped out overnight. And so we do have a real inflation, though, because when this starts happening, people decide they need to go ahead and buy a house. They need to pay 200% markup for lumber, or you need to eat, and food prices are going up. If you go to work, you need gas. And so the other thing that's growing is credit card debt, which was being paid down for a little while. So it's a real inflation. Whether it will get to a hyperinflation level or not is still to be questioned. But I think at the rate it's been growing, there's no doubt that we are headed toward hyperinflation. And this is very, very unsettling for people because you see your whole life's work wiped out. Your whole, if your sense of value is how much money you have, this is where you have suicides. This is where you have complete social breakdown.
So let's just take this a step further because right now we're seeing audits in Arizona, Maricopa County. We're seeing them in New Hampshire. We're seeing election audits now in Georgia. We're seeing it in Michigan, Pennsylvania now. So since they didn't get their great reset, since that didn't go as planned, if things start to go south with these audits and all of a sudden the legislatures say, you know something, there's this fraud here. And it's not just in one state, but it's in multiple states, and they start to decertify. Do you think these people will either collapse the system or do something to try to stop, the reversal of Biden being in the White House?
Well, I think this is where you have an increased danger of war. I don't know to what extent people follow these things, but the commander of STRATCOM, the Strategic Command, Admiral Charles Richard, recently said that the Pentagon has to change its thinking from believing that nuclear war is unlikely to thinking that nuclear war is increasingly likely. When you start having commanders on that level, just below the Joint Chiefs, talking about needing an upgrade in nuclear weapons to fight a nuclear war, these are the kinds of things that lead to war, like World War One. Once the troops started mobilizing, you couldn't stop it. But that took 6 months or 4 months. Today it takes 3 minutes or 5 minutes. So I think the possibility of new wars is very real. This nearly happened around Ukraine. What was the whole Ukraine thing about? Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, came out and said, we're going to take back Crimea.
Hmm.
Now, how the hell is Ukraine going to take back Crimea? Ukraine is one of the most bankrupt countries and corrupt countries in the world, and it's been even worse since Biden and Obama ran the coup in 2014.
Hmm.
The only way Ukraine could fight Russia is if you convince the United States and NATO to come in and back them up, in which case, within hours, Russia would overrun Ukraine and you'd have a decision have to be made as to whether or not we're going to use nuclear weapons. Now, I think some of these guys actually think that a limited nuclear war would be an effective tool to scare the hell out of everyone to accept whatever draconian security state measures they apply. And we're seeing this. The whole argument that January 6th was an insurrection. So therefore, we need to toughen the security laws. We need more surveillance. This is already going on, and the people who are doing this, I think this is the other point people just have to wrap their minds around. They're very desperate because they're about to lose everything. And had Trump won a second term, it's already been stated by many people that a second term would have finished off the so-called transatlantic alliance, which is a U.S., Euro, United Kingdom bankers dictatorship. So this is why a war becomes not just possible, but more likely. And I think that's the way they would, or false flag events, like 9/11. What was 9/11? That was used to get the original Patriot Act. So we have to be very vigilant in this period.
So when you said they're losing everything, what do you mean by that? But what are they? Are they? They're not in control. You're talking about like the deep state players, the private Western central bank, the corrupt politicians. They're not in control, and they're losing the fight.
I think they realize their control depends on the willingness of the people to accept their false narratives. Because otherwise, if people don't accept them, then what are they going to do? Have to use military force. They're going to have to use, if you can induce someone to put the chains on themselves, it's a lot easier than if you have a slave rebellion. And I really think that the people who are making policy, and if you read some of these articles that are coming out of the think tanks, the Atlantic Council, the CFR. I was on the other day one from the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is British intelligence, and what they were saying is that, well, what could we do if China decided to capture Taiwan? What could the U.S. military do? It couldn't do anything except launch a nuclear war. So I think they realized that their utopian plans to bluff the world into accepting this global dictatorship. Let's just say that they're not defeated, but they realize that they have to plan for the possibility that they're not going to win. And that's where the most important thing for those of us who are fighting this deep state is to recognize who exactly is the enemy. Not to get sidetracked, but
Hmm.
recognize that it's this coalition of bankers and global oligarchs that is a coherent grouping that has real names, whether it's someone like Fink of BlackRock or Lord Rothschild, the people who run BNP Paribas or Deutsche Bank. These are real people who make these plans. Biden, Obama, they're just puppets for these people. Then secondly, you have to make sure you know what their goal is so that you're fighting the right fight. Now, on the election issue, Dave, I think that's an important thing to just go back to. Um, I don't know what the result will be from the audit in Arizona and these other audits. I think it's unmistakable that a lot of illegal things happened on November 3rd and in the aftermath. I think one of the things that's going on in state legislatures is a move to establish a real basis for vote security, which we didn't have in 2020. And this is, you hear these screams from the Democrats, this is voter suppression. No, it's actually to make sure that more of the people who are actually eligible to vote can vote. But those who are not eligible, or those who are dead, or those who don't exist,
Yeah.
don't get a vote. And I think this is really important that we not lose sight of one of the lessons of 2020 is that you have to have local participation in the election process, including city and county election boards, county commissions, uh, look into who's being brought in to run the elections. This is really crucial. So whether or not we can overturn the 2020 election, I think that's somewhat of a long shot, but I think we can certainly use what happened then to make sure that there's not another stolen election.
So what happened? Let's just go off on this tangent. What happens if the election results from Arizona, because they're looking at 2.1 million ballots. Now in Georgia, they're looking at something like 145,000. Same thing in Pennsylvania. They just called for an audit there, and actually they're going to do an audit. New Hampshire, they're finding that the folds in the ballots have marked the ballot in a certain way, and it's only one-sided. So a lot of these things are starting to come together, and especially in Michigan also. We have Matt DePerno, the attorney there, showed how the Dominion machine actually flipped the votes. Mm-hmm. So if we see this pattern, and it's the same pattern with the same Dominion systems, with the same ballots, and we see it from state to state to state, where do we go from here if it shows that, yeah, these ballots, first of all, these people aren't real. There's right. 200,000 adjudicated ballots, and someone decided, okay, I'm going to mark this as Biden, and we find out that 200,000 votes really wasn't for Biden. Just like they're reporting that something like 950 absentee ballots that came from the soldiers all went from Biden. They said that's statistically impossible. What happens if they do prove election fraud and they show how it was done? What happens next?
Then I guess we're dependent, at least in the first go around, on whether or not the Supreme Court has the cojones to follow that up and overturn the election. I mean, if this can be done, can be proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, then you have probably the most profound political crisis in our nation's history. And I think from what we've been discussing up to this point, it's also clear that even if that doesn't happen, we're in the most profound political crisis. But that would give us a standing, which is something many people have been calling for, to be able to then say, okay, if this is provable fraud, what does that mean about who's in the White House? And then you come up to the question of whether the courts will act on it, and if not, who else can act on it? And this is where you come down to the question of the people need to mobilize. And I don't necessarily mean by guns and bombs and right. things of that sort, but to make sure that we use our power. If we can prove this, then that puts us in a much better, stronger position to make sure that the changes are made in legislation that will prevent this from happening in 2022 or 2024. So, rather than getting to an apocalyptic state of mind over it, I think it really boils down to what we've been talking about. We've got to have a real awakening in the population that there is corruption. There's a corrupt cabal that didn't just act on November 2020, but was acting from the day Donald Trump launched his campaign. That corruption was systemic, and it was in all the major government institutions. The people who are making policy today at the State Department, in the CIA, in the Justice Department, in the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, many of them are corrupt, provably corrupt. So, I think if people get to understand that, we can have a much bigger result than the 75 million that were officially credited in the last election, to make it impossible to ever do that again. So, let me leave it at that, because I don't know what else we could do within the bounds of the Constitution.
If it is proven, I guess the laws that they enacted, not by the legislature, but by governors, Secretary of State, Attorney
Yeah, they all get
Generals.
thrown out. They have to
Yeah,
be thrown out.
because right now, I mean, putting everything into place where, you had these ballot boxes and you had, a couple of extra days to have the ballots come in. All those laws were not created by the legislature. They were created
They
by,
were, they were all violations of the Constitution, and many of the legislatures are actually acting on that now. In Pennsylvania, right after the election, there were a series of hearings of some of the Republicans who stood up and said, look, what was done violated the state and the federal Constitution. And at the time, people shrugged it off. Well, we have a job to do to make sure that a majority of the population knows that, because that makes everything easier if it becomes known. And we have to figure out how to do it outside the mainstream media, because the mainstream media is not going to cover it.
no, they're not going to cover anything. Actually, their ratings are dropping like a rock. More and more people are moving away from the mainstream media and
Sure.
looking for news in other places. And I think their time is coming. I think everything that they did during the election, where they told us there's no such thing as election fraud, no such thing as cheating or anything like that. I think this is all going to come back to hit them, just like Fauci with the Wuhan lab and the gain of function. I think this is all going to boomerang back on them. And I
Well,
don't
they
think.
not only say these
Mm,
things, but they censor anyone who tells
yes,
the truth.
that is correct.
And more people are becoming aware that what you're getting from CNN or MSNBC, that's why people are turning it off. They aren't going to tolerate this lying anymore. And again, that's why I think the arc of history is on our side. It's bending toward real justice. But there was a very famous comment by Martin Luther King once where he said, the arc of history bends toward justice, but the people have to be the agency that bends it.
Mm.
And I think that's where we are right now. And the other side with their Black Lives Matter and their defunding police, these are not popular positions. The question is not racism or not racism. The question is subverting the Constitution. And will people stand up and defend the constitutional sovereign republic that we were given back in the end of the 18th century and that we fought for and defended for 240 years or 230 years?
I think the people will in the end. I think people will stand up for the Constitution once everything is brought out into the open and people learn more, they understand more, and they realize who the true enemy is. It's not us, we the people. It's actually the bankers, the corrupt politicians who've been telling us something completely different where, oh no, it's racism, it's this, it's that. They're the enemy of the people. And I think people are going to start to realize that. I think people are going to wake up to the fact. I think it's happening right now. I think there's a lot
Sure.
more people right now that understand that there's something wrong.
Well, and people react against things like identity politics, which is one of the more absurd formulations. But this has been what's been practiced in international relations since the end of the 19th century. This is what geopolitics is. You find the narrowest sense of identity and divide each group against the other. It's to create the law of the jungle, the survival of the fittest. My group has to fight if we're going to get our share of a shrinking pie. And instead, we have to get all these groups to recognize there is such a thing as a national mission.
Hmm.
We have a national mission. And if we function that way, then every group within it will benefit, not because they're a special privileged group, but because they're part of a national mission and a people who are committed to that. And so that's what the fight is. And, the invention of 60 new sexes and, the, what is it, the 1619 project or whatever the New York
Yeah, the
Times launched,
1619 project, yeah.
critical race theory. It's to really make people who are feeling victimized look for some small thing to hang on to. And we have something that's really quite big to hang on to, which is the history of our nation as a constitutional republic. And I think that's where we have to focus a lot of our mental energies.
I agree. Harley, thank you very much for being on the X22 Report Spotlight. Once again, how can people get in touch with you and see your work?
Well, send me an email at my personal email, and I'll send you a link to my blog site for free. You can sign up, you'll get notifications. So write to me at harleysch@gmail.com. Last time I was on, Dave, I was just swamped with emails, a lot of really interesting people looking for, your
Hmm.
viewers and listeners, they're looking for the truth. And
Yeah.
if I can help you find it, just send me an email at harleysch@gmail.com, and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can.
Harley, once again, thank you very much for being on the Spotlight. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dave.